Hello everyone, Al Lewison here, hosting OpenCorp Facebook Live, November 2019. I'll do my best Michael Beresford impersonation. Al Lewison here with the big guns, Matt Lewison and Ken McLellan. Welcome to our Facebook Live. Lots of topics to cover off tonight. Thank you for joining us and looking forward to getting through a fair bit of great property advice for everyone during the show.
Done a great Michael impersonation there, mate.
Thanks, Ken.
Yeah. How do you turn that sound down?
So we thought we'd start off, and obviously the year commenced with, and I'll sort this out in a moment. The year commenced with some very big ups and downs in the property market. We started the year off, and this time last year in our business, we were talking about. Thanks, Cam. We were talking about how horrible property was at the time, and it started 2019 in not much better fashion. So we rolled into halfway through the year, and there's a fairly big bump and spike in terms of what happened in property. A big event happened there. We've probably seen the benefits of it across the property sector since that time.
Now, obviously, there's been some lagging states in the last couple of years. Perth's been one of those markets that's really, I guess, struggled with the price growth. In fact, the price has been going down steadily for about 4 years. One of the things that's led that has been really weak employment, obviously state or net state immigration, and that's starting to turn the corner very slowly in Perth as well. I mean, we're not saying that Perth's the market we want to jump into, but we've been monitoring that for a while, and it's starting to turn that corner slowly. Brisbane's obviously got great fundamentals still. Victoria has as well. But one of the things that we've really been saying for a while is that the markets that were the most affected were the premium markets in Sydney and Melbourne. We saw markets around and below the median house prices do pretty well through that downturn. But the market that's bouncing back the fastest is those premium markets. And if you look at the fundamentals underlying that, what we see is that Sydney's still got a very high vacancy rate. And some of the stats that we saw coming through this week was that the biggest mover in the Sydney market has been investment in the Sydney market. So we're seeing in a market that's already oversupplied with rental stock that there's a lot of investors pouring into that market. There's a bit of speculation starting to happen in Sydney. And I guess our fear for Sydney is that it's going to be a bit of a dead cat bounce, where the prices come up, results in a lot of speculation, more supply coming through, and actually saturates that market pretty quickly. That said, when you look at Melbourne, very different scenario because we've already got low vacancy rates. We've got underbuilding in some of the built form areas, and built form we talk about is obviously apartments and townhouses. So the Melbourne market, and the RBA came out and said this last week, there's a big concern of a looming undersupply in the Melbourne market and the Australian housing market in general. So I mean that just obviously bodes really well for the next couple of years. We don't want to look too short at the next 4 or 5 months. It's probably going to be pretty strong as those premium markets recover. But more importantly, the 12 to 24 month outlook is really positive for the sort of the median house price property and those below the median, which is sort of starved of supply.
Yeah, I think probably coupling that, you touched on it briefly there, is obviously the struggle with apartment developers are having at this point in time. And lending regulations, the press, the issue with selling product, that issue slowing down. It puts more pressure back on the housing supply of medium density housing and house and land type product, which is great for investors who are holding that type of product or buying that type of product.
And to put this into perspective, the number of apartments being built in Melbourne and Sydney at the moment are down about 80% on their peak. So that's the starts are down 80%. So you just think it's going to take 2 years for anything to be built. So normally the apartment cycle is 2 years. So we're already seeing a slowdown in the completions, and that's going to keep running out for the next 2 years. Brisbane's already had that pullback in starts, and they're down about 90% on where they started, where they were in the peak in about 2017. So they're the first that's going to see the effects of this undersupply coming through the market as well.
Yeah.
So we typically talk to clients who are talking that property is a long-term thing. You're not buying it to have a win in the 4 months since May to November, 5 months. And I was reading some stats last week that indicated that this is Melbourne, that the number of dwellings within Melbourne will grow from where it is to double the current amount in 30 years' time. Now, 30 years is a long time to view, but I think in terms of someone's investment strategy, and we talk about it being long-term and 30 years extreme, as I said, but what does that impact make to people? Because obviously people need to live somewhere, houses are going to double in terms of quantum available. What do you see happening in that period of time? And it's quite extended view, as I said.
And I'll let you answer this, Matt, but also take into consideration if you wouldn't mind commenting on the urban growth boundary and the time it takes for the government to change the urban growth boundary.
All right.
Yeah,
Thank
throw-
you.
yeah,
That's
no,
a
that's nice.
16 faceted question there for Matt. Nice easy one.
Okay. So urban growth boundary, I mean, they're supposed to be set for 15 years. So they're supposed to provide enough supply for that city market for the next 15 years. Now, one of the flaws with the urban growth boundary, everywhere that it exists around the world, is that it's not uniform. So while there might be enough supply across the Melbourne market for the next 15 years, it's kind of concentrated in a few pockets, and there's a number of pockets where there's no supply or virtually none. Obviously, if you look at the eastern suburbs, like you go out towards Lilydale, out towards the Yarra Ranges, and the urban growth boundary hasn't moved for the last 15 years. There's no new supply because you're hard up against the Yarra Ranges there, and obviously great wine country, so they're not extending it that way. And you can go around those urban growth boundaries in every capital city and find pockets where there's actually going to be limited opportunities to extend that urban growth boundary. So while holistically they say there's enough supply for the next 15 years, when you look locally, it's very hard to match that supply. But if we, again, I love looking at, as you guys know, looking around the world and trying to learn what I can from other cities. Now the forecast from the ABS is that Australia's population is obviously going to more than double, or essentially double by the year 2060. And Melbourne and Sydney's population is going to exceed 11 million people, and that's around the median forecast for those cities. So already Melbourne and Sydney would be in the top 5 biggest cities or metropolitan areas if they were in America. America's got hundreds of millions of people, huge population compared to Australia, but only a few cities that are larger than Melbourne and Sydney. So we've got these kind of very large cities already, and by the time they get to 11 million people, they'll be as large as New York. Not the whole tri-state area, but New York City themselves. So when you imagine that, New York's one of the most expensive property markets in the world, with very small properties and obviously huge price bracket to get in, even just to a small apartment, and you sort of you try to envisage what Melbourne will be like then in another 30 years, you kind of have to apply the same framework and say, well, it's going to be really hard to get into the property market. Not only is there twice as many people, it's twice as many wealthy people with a lot more money as well if wealth concentration keeps going up. So that pushes up all sorts of prices, but also makes it harder to get in at the bottom area or the bottom end.
Population growth's a good one to look at. If you look back 10, 20 years at the forecast of, I remember Dick Smith was on the radio. I just noticed that because I like listening to Dick. He's got some pretty opinionated viewpoints. But he was pointing out, and I look back at the stats, he was correct, that by 2030 our population will be 25 million. Well, we've obviously exceeded that. Already hit that. Now, saying that, I do like listening to Dick, but and I love the way he pushes Australian product. Saying that, he did make all his money importing, cheap electronic stuff from overseas. But hey, he's found the ways of his evil business ways.
Yeah.
But population growth forecast, the government don't like to give. Sorry, they're not hiding anything, but they'll undercook it because they don't like the media coming back on them saying you're trying to crowd our country too hard. But the reality
Too big,
is,
yep.
Yeah, they need that population growth.
I think it's almost impossible for them to predict what the population growth is going to be. You don't know how many people are going to have babies and whether there's going to be a mini baby boom. But obviously, one of the key things that's been around for a long time in Australia is this sort of shortage of workers. And with our ageing population, obviously there's a lot. I think the stat was around 40 years ago, there was 7 workers per retired person. Right now it's 4. In another 20 years' time, it's going to be 2 workers per retiree. So you think, who's paying the taxes to fund all the services and the retirement, pension for all the people who are retired? So they obviously need to keep bringing more people in. And even when the government sort of talked about a year ago of maybe dampening down the immigration, they can that as soon as they had the experts come in the door and say, hey, if you guys actually knock down immigration, you're nuts because you won't be able to provide the services you need for your country in the future. So I think that's one of the things that we take as a standard. We know that there's going to be strong population growth in Australia. It's really underpinning house price growth.
I think one thing, we'll get into some questions because I want to answer things, but I think you and I were looking at a site, I can't remember it the other day, which the government had, it was Casey Council, the government were predicting they wanted X percentage living and working within Casey by a certain date, and they had actually beaten that forecast and actually smashed it. They had about 7% of population travelling to the CBD. Is that right from memory? It was a while ago we looked at that stat. Yeah. So the government sometimes do get it right. So the activity centres that they've set up about keeping local people and minimising the transport and pressure on infrastructure, they're actually not doing too bad on that front.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll cut you off, guys. Got some great questions coming in, and keep them coming. Really great question from Stuart here. And Stuart's a client of OpenCorp. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Stuart.
Stuart said, my OpenCorp property that I purchased has just reached completion, got a tenant. When is the right time to go again and get another property?
If I go back and put in my rose-coloured glasses on, and like I said, sometimes my glasses are Elton John rose-coloured glasses, and some of their Bono a bit smaller. But if I think back to what I actually asked your dad Steve this 20, 25 years ago, and said, when's the best time to buy property? And he said 20 years ago, and he said the next time is as soon as you can afford it. So let's think about this year. It's a ripper question, Stuart, because we were just talking earlier about. Let's roll through, give us some of the fundamental things that have occurred this year. And if you listen to the media or what was going on in the world, and you made your buying decisions based on that, there's no chance you would have purchased this year.
But I'll preface that. So, Cam, when you're accused of having rose-coloured glasses, be it Elton or Bono, we're in May. So someone put their hand up and said, Cam, you're always saying now's the right time to buy property. You're saying it now and it's the worst time property that's ever existed in the last 30 years. Well, what would you say to those people now? Yes, buy property in May, absolutely.
Yeah.
The right time to buy is when you can buy. In terms of some of the things during the year that you talked about, well, the key ones and the things that started this growth for us, I guess, off the back of May was the election result. I guess from some of the talk that was happening about getting negative gearing, some of the other things that the Labor Party were talking about that weren't overly favourable to investment, and particularly property investment. Well, Liberals won, so sun came up on Sunday morning. We moved forward a couple of steps. About 3 days later, APRA came out and made an announcement saying that they're reviewing what's happening and they'd like the banks to decrease the buffers they're applying to people's loans. Move forward 2 days after that or something thereabouts, maybe a week, and the RBA dropped interest rates. So all of a sudden we had a perfect storm of three things indicating that we needed to get some movement back into the property market.
Yeah. Investors also had to consider world news, and I think this impacts it. So North Korea and Trump were at a Twitter war at one point in time there. Then they were best mates and holding hands and skipping happily down the road. Then they were angry, enemies again. I'm not sure where that's at currently. The China-US trade crisis was on. World was going to collapse there, and people were referring back to the GFC and recession days and those sort of things. Which I should point out, during the recession, median house prices only took a 10% nosedive and then bounced back really quickly. So at any point during this year, taking into short-term media inspirations, you may or may not purchase. Everyone's individual situation, but going back to what you're saying about the rose-coloured glasses, I've purchased every year for the last 20 years. Some years I've told people who want to buy in specific spots not to purchase because my Bono glasses will only see a small portion of different markets, as opposed to what I said in May after the election that the Elton John glasses are out and things are looking rosy again.
And I think we say that when you put your rose-coloured glasses on, you're saying property's great. You're looking at it through a lens of what are the vacancy rates, what's population growth doing, what's employment, what's happening in the local area, where's the right place to be buying at that point in time, not throwing a blanket over all of Australia, or going to the local real estate agent saying, do you have any stock on your list that I can buy?
Yeah.
Yes, they would. What's the right one for you at that point in time?
Yeah, at a really hot market, if you get in at the start of a really hot market, which is always tough to pinpoint the prediction, the old saying, all boats float on a rising tide, the entire market goes up. In a slow-moving market or even a downturn, you need to get really specific about where you're purchasing, and that's obviously what our clients utilise us for.
Yep. Got another great question here from Bernie. Welcome, Bernie.
Thanks, Stuart.
Thanks, Stuart. Do you see lending, probably a good one for Matt, do you see lending becoming more accessible again soon? And will the banks offer go back to 95% LVR products again? Are we seeing many of those in the market?
All right, well, I can't really comment on the 95% LVR, other than obviously with the first home buyers, and that's largely because the government's encouraging that. The government wants more first home buyers in the market, and they're obviously subsidising the lender's mortgage insurance on behalf of the borrower, although there's obviously a bit of pushback from the banks there. But obviously that's one thing that we'll see, up to 10,000 first home buyers per year coming into the market with that very high LVR potentially. So at certain parts of the market, that'll probably push up prices. But in terms of the lending environment itself, I mean, it comes back to a comment that Cam made earlier about looking globally. Interest rates aren't low because Australia's economy is tanking. Interest rates are low because everywhere in the developed world, interest rates are low. There's a competition for exports, and as a result of that, the reserve banks or central banks need to be very competitive with their interest rates to avoid the currency being overvalued. And sorry if I get technical on that.
No, that's our resident geek, so go crazy.
Now, it's funny because I actually read today an article by an economist from the US, and he was saying that with the policy of the central banks at the moment, they're actually becoming dampened. The effect that they're having is muted, and what they really need is government intervention. Government needs to start spending more money, again, around the world on infrastructure, because in the absence of government spending money on infrastructure, reserve banks will push down interest rates, and the effect that has is it puts the money into wealthy people's hands, that allows their helps to push up asset prices to make them more wealthy. And the hope is that by the asset prices going up, they'll invest in other things that are going to generate more jobs. Yeah. So again, you kind of have to look at this whole cycle and say, well, the whole cycle is geared by governments or central banks. The intention is to push up asset prices, and what's going to happen to house prices? Well, they'll get pushed up like all others around the world. Yeah. So we kind of think that, and again, we're seeing in the banking space, banks are becoming more competitive. They want to start growing their profits again. So yes, it's going to get, I guess, a bit more aggressive in terms of banks trying to get your custom.
Definitely trying to increase the loan pool. Just to give away a little bit about the next show, next month, December's show, we've got finance expert Amanda Glebe joining us on the panel here, so you can get really specific on. She obviously knows the ins and outs of different lenders and what they're lending as far as in comparison to the overall market. And
if I just piggyback off what Matt was saying there about how I guess the central banks and the governments are trying to do the right thing to grow investment, grow people's wealth, and keep the economy moving along. A key one in property, and there's a couple of different forces at play here. APRA's trying to, I guess, make sure that the banks are protected, their balance sheets are strong, and our banking sector is, robust. But I heard a stat the other day, which is that if for every $1 spent in construction, that generates $2.5 spending out in the economy. So the governments are going to want people out there building, developing, constructing, because that has a massive flow-on effect, the biggest of anything. To give another example, money spent on infrastructure generates 0.7, so 70 cents out to the market. So fairly dramatic increase if they can get money being spent in those sectors. Mattery talked about 80% slowdown in apartment starts. So straight away you start to work it through in your mind. The government wants people out there borrowing money, building, developing, and making the economy move along.
Yeah, and you mentioned the difference. I think it's important to understand there's infrastructure spending, which gets the economy going, but you're right, 0.7 is really because large corporates are running those infrastructure projects compared to average mum and dad builders who drive the majority of the building industry.
But I sound as smart as Matt with my massive stat there. Matt's there going, damn it, that should be my stat. Why haven't I got that stat?
What else we got?
Yeah, it's on the screen, isn't it?
We've got a question here from Marcus. Hello, Marcus. And thanks, Bernie, for your question about lending. Really good one. And as Cam said, next month we can be super specific or touch base and we can look at your situation. Marcus, how much deposit do I need to enter the property market? Really great question. And I think it's a question that lots and lots of people sit back wondering. And there's really quick and easy ways to get answers to that. But Cam, do you want to jump in with the answer to that one?
Yeah, really high level, and this comes down, and Michael, who joins us on the show, and Amanda would probably kick me for being specific, so this is very general advice. Shoot through an email to justin@opencorp.com.au, and Justin will be able to get a borrowing capacity done for you, because there's a lot of factors come in. Dependence come in place, household income, expenditure over the last 3 months, but really raw numbers. If you've got 70 grand, 120k of household income, then you're probably in a pretty good spot. But there's a lot of moving parts around that. So to get your specific, and look, I in early days investing, I used to get my borrowing capacity done every 3 months. It was just literally got a best statement done, got my borrowing capacity done. So always needing, and as I think Stuart was trying to determine, because the banks are getting more aggressive in what they'll lend out in the loan pool that they want to drag in. If you got your borrowing capacity checked out today, in 3 months' time it's going to be different again and probably more favourable. So if you haven't got your borrowing capacity done, email justin@opencorp.com.au and he'll get it done for you.
Yep. Question here from Mike Quinn. Hello, Mike. And just a little plug for Mike. Mike's just finished painting my house. Great painter. Find him on Facebook. Message him. Great painter. So if you need some painting done,
quintessential.
There
painting,
he is.
Is that right? Quintessential
painting. Mike's just saying that on the news tonight they said that property will move for the next 12 months and then dip again. And his question is, how do you decipher all this noise going on out in the market, white noise, things like that every day? It's a different story. How do you determine what's right, what's wrong?
Well, I'm happy to add to the white noise, but maybe Cam
can
talk about
first.
what the... No, I suppose, we've talked about and used the term, I guess, uncertainty is the frenemy of the investor. And we say that because uncertainty can create the most value for an investor, because if everybody's scared, like as Warren Buffett says, when everybody else is scared, that's the best time to be greedy. But when everyone's scared, it's normally because there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of white noise, and that's where you can create opportunities. But it also plays up on our minds, and it, I guess, scares us as well. So it helps to, I guess, try to see through that, but be aware of your own feelings about some of that white noise. But
yeah, I think that's why it's good, I suppose, the partnership we've had over the last 20 years as investment friends and business partners, because I'm probably a little bit more long-term in the play. I understand the long-term fundamentals of the market, and I don't mind as long as I can service my portfolio if the market does take a dip like it did from 17 to May. You know, I'm used to that, and I'm ready for that across my portfolio, as long as it's funding itself and there's enough buffer there. But I can understand that you love getting into the stats and details and finding out what is curving the market on the shorter term. So it gives us a good balance.
I think in the last, also in the last webinar that I was in with you guys, we also looked at what was driving the market. And at the moment, there's a bit of a top-down market forces, which is that the top end of the market there's a lot of competition there because there's not many properties on the market. It's pushing up prices. They'll probably bounce back up to where they were pretty quickly. And then I reckon there'll be a bit of heat and runs out of that market. But at the other end of the market, the bottom end, which is what generally drives a more sustainable market, I guess, uplift, there's very short vacancies. There's a lot of competition. We're seeing more people competing for properties from tenants.
It's a real bottom-up push.
So that pushes property prices up from the bottom, and that takes a little bit longer to start to kick in, but it actually runs for a longer time, because the only way to overcome that is by building a lot more houses to increase the supply. You can obviously put more houses on the market in a premium suburb, just by an extra 30 people deciding to list their property that week. It's short term, but it will probably push up prices briefly, but you can't increase the supply in a whole city just by clicking your fingers.
Yeah, and a bit I'd probably add to that for Mike is, yes, the news says certain things, and every day it says something different, and we don't talk shares on the show because we love property. We don't love it, we like property. But if you listen to the stock market, and every second day you open the paper up and it's gone up and down 3 cents, and up the next day and down the next day, and Wall Street's collapsed and the dollar's down and the share price is up and it's down, that's really hard to see. But if you take a long-term view and go, what's happening over the next 30 years in the property market, because population and dwellings are going to double just in Melbourne, well, you're pretty safe to say that there might be some little ups and downs through the journey, but you've got to be investing for the long term in property, not speculating to, I guess, strike gold in the next 3 months.
There you go. There you go. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
Quintessential painter.
Yeah, great painter. Marcus, really good question, and I might get one of you guys to talk about rentvesting. Marcus Ross, his question is, should I buy an investment whilst renting, and what are the pros and cons? And I think the really important thing we should talk about is living where you want to live, investing where it makes sense, and having the lifestyle you want. Yeah,
I'm going to give you a very strong yes, Marcus, on that one. That's what each of us did. It's what nearly every successful investor I know has done. So there are a few now that are getting into similar age as myself who might be starting their investment journey a bit later. We've got clients who are pushing into retirement and are going back and rent vesting. So it's if you can handle it. So for Felicity and myself, we wanted to live in the beachside suburb of Elwood when we were kids, 20 years old, thereabouts. We looked at a 2-bedroom Art Deco apartment in a block of 4, and I think at the time we did the numbers on that. We ended up renting it. We looked at purchasing it because we had a pretty serious portfolio at that stage. But at that stage, what I worked out, and Felicity and I worked out, is that we could hold, it was nearly double the value of asset for the same money it would have cost us to purchase that property and hold it. So while Elwood might have gone up at, hypothetically, at 2% more than the suburbs we were buying in, if I've got double the amount of asset and I can live where I want to live, well then obviously and the old saying is, wealth is gained by holding the most amount of asset with the least amount of money out of your back pocket. So it's a really smart choice to go and rent where you want to live, and I know you guys have done the same back in the day.
Yeah, absolutely. It caused a lot of angst between my now wife, but girlfriend at the time, because she wanted us to be buying our house together, and I already had investment properties. She couldn't understand why I didn't just want to buy a property that we could live in. I said, well, I want to live in West End, was in Brisbane, right next to the city, had a great lifestyle, but I didn't want to be investing there. So.
And Marcus, just another way to answer it, and the guys are giving really, I guess, factual accounts of what they've done personally, but I think if you're interested, we can sit down with you and do the numbers, because whenever people have come in and the husband and wife might be at loggerheads, she wants to buy their dream home, he wants to invest to make money.
I've had the other way around.
Well, whichever way it goes, we sit down and run through the numbers. It absolutely makes sense for people to understand how rent investing, we invented it. We invented it. How rent investing can benefit someone. So it's a really great question and something lots and lots of people think about, but absolutely, and to go back to what Cam said before, get in the market whenever you can. If you're renting, you've got a deposit, what a great opportunity to buy yourself an investment property and ride the growth in the market, because what I hate people doing is sitting there, not investing, market goes up 10% in the next 2 years, your deposit amount increases by 10%. It's really hard to save as it is, so jump in when you can.
It's a mathematical equation, so while you would like to get emotion in it, really the emotion should be, where do I want to live for lifestyle? And then Justin can run the numbers for you really quickly and look at, all right, what money is that going to cost you versus buying the property? What can you do with that money investing it elsewhere if you were to rent vest versus buying it, and make it a mathematical equation.
Cam just wanted the last word on that question, but he didn't get it.
Yes, I did.
No, you didn't?
Yes, I did.
All right, thanks again. Thanks, Marcus. Really good question. G'day, Bruce Stevenson. Thanks for logging in.
B. Stevenson.
A question here from Ben, and really relevant question. What are the main reasons Australians don't take action and achieve financial independence through property? Similar probably to what Mike's saying before. Lots of white noise, lots of things going on, and fear comes in. It's really easy to come across a dream crusher at a barbecue. Your uncle says you're stupid because you're thinking about buying a property, you should buy shares, you know someone who's got a great horse to put your money on, whatever it is. But yeah, there's lots of reasons, guys. What creates people to have that fear they don't go ahead?
Probably the main one is they haven't done it themselves. If you really look at it, I think I worked out the amount of people that have 6 or more properties. If you filled the entire MCG, to put it in perspective, so the amount of people who are successful investors, 6 or more properties, are sort of deemed that as by the ATO. If you fill the entire MCG in grand final day, 63 out of those people will have a serious portfolio. So you can imagine the amount of, if you went and asked every person in the G, what do you think about property investing? There's 63 out of 100,000 thereabouts that are going to say property investing is fantastic because of these. Your
confidence is pummeled to a point to oblivion before you get to the 63 that are scattered around the whole stand.
Exactly right, and the majority of the others won't do it. Will say it's bad because they haven't done it themselves.
I reckon also, and sorry to bring it back to a personal experience here.
No, the personal stuff's good. I was just rounding it out before.
So when we started investing in property, we had our dad who we'd obviously seen go through the journey. It was actually 15 years we got to watch him go through building his investment portfolio, borrowing from banks. He talked about what he was doing all the time around the dinner table, to the point where we were bored of hearing his sayings, which now we're regurgitating on this show.
Time is on your side.
The best time to invest is as soon as you can afford. But because of that, it gave us a bit of comfort. Now, there were still doubts, and it was obviously even after our first investment, there were still times when I'd probably be laying in bed going, have we done the right thing? But then the market boomed, it took off, and we made a heap of money on our first property and go, wow, well, let's do this again. And we kind of overcame that fear, and we also had each other and our friends who were going through the same process. So we kind of were able to help each other, and it made it a little bit easier. And obviously people who don't have that, who are out there on their own, can easily be overcome by fear and become paralysed.
I think it's the benefit people or clients get out of our client nights when you put 100, 200 like-minded people in the room and just let them talk through their fears and woes and successes, and all of a sudden you get a nice vibe of success going through the room, and it gives you a bit of motivation to go and do it again, or to know you're on the right track. Yep. Having a set process removes a lot of the fear. So early days, I felt the majority of Australians were investing blindfolded. There was no strategy. It frustrated the hell out of me. I had a business background, so the process was business is all about, and I didn't understand why property investing wasn't treated like a business. So I think once you've got a set process that works, anything else that comes along, any negativity, any other investment strategy, you match it against your strategy, work out which wins, your proven strategy, 9 times out of 10 wins, and you stick with it.
Isn't that like page 3 of your book as well? Like kids, process gives me control.
That's right, it does. I've got no control over my kids, but yes, it does.
And I sound like a broken record, but I say it nearly every day in the office. It's not about picking a winner over the next 6 months. It's about, if you can outperform in the next 4 years, 3 to 4 years, you've done really well. Next 10 years, you've gone through a whole cycle and you'll be well ahead. But the reason that uncertainty comes in, as Cam said, is people just aren't confident in what they're doing. And Matt nailed it. I was going to say the same thing, but he stole my thunder. I had a mentor that said to me, here, take me by the hand, do this, that's the right one. I know it's the right one because I've done it before. Here's an example. We can help with the same thing for people, but gives you that confidence that people have got your back.
There you go.
A question here is people talk about traditional property cycles in Melbourne, and we talk about as well. Typically, Sydney's the market leader. Growth in Sydney has some growth for 12 months, 18 months, 2 years. Flows into Melbourne. Melbourne will have some growth. Brisbane should follow. You roll into Perth, following in that market. Now, off the back of the last one we saw, probably not traditionally, it didn't follow that pattern exactly, but what drives those markets and why do we see that time and time again in the Australian property cycles?
Let you take this on, Matt. Happy to chime in.
Yeah, well, again, we can bring it back to population growth in some ways. So obviously Sydney's always had very strong population growth. They get a lot of overseas arrivals, so net overseas migration's really strong. They get a really strong jobs market as well. It's kind of the engine room of the country at times. And as a result of that population growth and strong jobs, it obviously pushes up prices. There's also a lot of embedded wealth in Sydney, and this is a term probably everyone's eyes are glazing over right about now. So embedded wealth means obviously if you've had wealth in a family for generations, then it's a lot easier for the next generation to get into the property market because they're inheriting wealth, and as a result they have lower debt. So in a lot of those really expensive suburbs, and let's look at Mosman and places like that, or Potts Point, it's people who have had wealth, often people who have had wealth in their families for a long time own that. They don't owe a lot of money on those properties. So it actually helps to lift up the prices in that market beyond what you think somebody should be able to afford. Now, obviously, that lifts the rest of the market. Then prices get a little bit out of hand in terms of affordability, and people start going, oh, the grass is probably greener on the other side. And often they start looking at Brisbane and they start looking at Melbourne because they're an hour's commute or flight. Their markets are normally a lot more affordable. Well, right now, Melbourne, it's about 20% less or more affordable than Sydney, and Brisbane's about 50% more affordable. So a lot of people leaving Sydney now, cashing in their house, moving to Brisbane and owning a property with no mortgage that's probably comparable in terms of amenity, and they're able to get a job where their income is pretty much within 2% of what they were getting in Sydney anyway.
So it's under 3,000.
So that helps, that cycle of Sydney prices lifting actually lead to the other markets through that mechanism.
Yeah. One thing I noticed, and I'd pull out of that in terms of the last property cycle, is we had a manufactured correction. Property's a supply and demand market, and supply and demand are what drives the market. And so the market was probably progressing as you'd expect it to. Sydney had its growth, Melbourne had its growth, and we're probably about that time that Brisbane was going to really jump into it. And I'm not saying it's missed it, but what happened was that APRA stepped in, took away the ability for a lot of people to borrow money, putting the brakes very heavily on the property market, which probably stalled, I'd say stalled, didn't delay, didn't move it, stalled what was happening in terms of the traditional cycle. So that's opened up again as of May this year. We've seen Melbourne straight away spring back, 3.9% growth in 5 months. Sydney had 1.3% growth last month, and Brisbane's had the strongest growth over that period of time of all the capitals. Yeah. So we're starting to see Brisbane start to accelerate, but we're also seeing Melbourne start to go back to where it was. And if you talk to any real estate agent in Melbourne, I talk to them every day, they've got no stock in their books. None of them have got stock. There's a massive shortage of stock. And Matt said it before, no jobs are starting, development can't happen, builders can't get on site.
So pressure's still coming on. Yeah.
It's like a pressure cooker just pushing price up, which is why we're seeing a great auction market through spring in Melbourne.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anything else?
No, I think you know.
Question here, and Matt sort of touched on it before, but I think it's an important one to talk about. And Cam in his book talks about drawing a point between your property and a capital city, but I'll let him answer it. Why are there corridors in cities that grow faster than other suburbs? Mm-hmm. And what would you look for in a suburb that makes it a better option?
Yeah, I'd probably take a wider view and look at the growth corridor going through there. We've probably got a slight advantage trying to think of the average investor, the best way to do it, but I look at the infrastructure projects going through there. So have a look at the local planning infrastructure that's set in budget. Go and talk to the town planners of what's going in there. Match that with the population growth forecast. It's not an easy thing to do. The easiest way to look at it is the supply through those corridors as well. If you've got contacts within the development community, the local town planning, you find out what's under contract at the moment as far as the development goes. You can balance out and try and work out what supply is coming onto the market. Now you need to do that across multiple corridors to work out which corridor you're favourable with to start with, and then once you're in that, then you can get down a bit more macro and start to identify where those pockets are going to be to get growth. So it's not a, hey, here's an easy checklist. I've tried to outline it as best I could in the book. There's a lot more science that goes into it.
I started laughing a little bit when Cam was talking about identifying sort of the supply that's coming through. So to put some context around that kind of means you have to talk to every developer in a corridor.
You do, which we do.
Find out how much they have approved, find out what sales rate they've got, how many stages they're delivering per year, how many...
That's your life, isn't it?
So it does get complex. There's obviously a way to do it, but it is quite complex when you start looking at that level. So, and probably just one more. Sorry, I heard you taking a big breath like you're going to say something. Either that or you're excited to hear what I've got to say. The other thing that makes it...
Always,
yeah. The other thing that makes it a little bit different now to what it was in the past. So previously, you obviously would have tried to be as close to the CBD as you could possibly be. And that's started to change, and the rules of the game have been changing for something Cam mentioned earlier, that the councils in a lot of the growth areas have got targets for job retention. So they don't want people driving in their car from Casey, which is 45, 50 kilometres southeast of Melbourne CBD, to Melbourne along the Monash Freeway every day. They don't want people taking that route, and they don't want them on trains either going to the city. So what they're finding is that they've got targets to achieve a maximum number of jobs through retail, hospitality, through health, and obviously by having decentralised businesses and other
government
other CBDs around the metropolitan area. So that starts to change where people really want to live. And a place like the southeastern corridor of Melbourne, which I think when we were growing up, we were 20 kilometres, 22 k's from the city. And our parents tell us, and it was another one of the things Dad used to love boring us with.
Broken record type stuff.
That it was the edge. It was like going on a day trip from Burwood to get to Scoresby. It was only a 10-kilometre drive, but he said it was a day trip. And that was the edge of the suburbs. Now fast forward 40 years, the suburbs go another 40 kilometres. They're 3 times as far as what it was back then. So it's really accelerated through that southeastern corridor. And it's the same in other cities as well, where some corridors kind of attract more people, maybe through the amenity that's already there. And that's obviously some things you need to be mindful of. It's not just about CBD, it's about where are the other jobs and what's bringing people to this area and keeping them employed.
I think he always talked about overpaying for his place in Scoresby as well, and it'd be worth like 15 times what he purchased it for.
Yeah, I did the numbers. I think he paid 30,000. I might be rounding up or down slightly, and I did the numbers that within 40 years it was worth 800. So when I talk about let's look at 30-year growth and you worry about tomorrow what's happening in the news, then that's sort of a good one to look at.
And let's say the future's half that. Yeah, still pretty good.
Ben wants to know, if we're big noters, so Ben wants to know, when you guys started your investment journey, did you let others know what you were doing, or were you doing it discreetly?
I did. My parents were dream crushers. So I told a couple of people, and then I just shut up for about a good 5 years, I think, and I sort of let people realise that I was going on more holidays than the majority and were able to purchase additional properties. But yeah, I definitely kept it pretty quiet myself until I found other guys that were doing it, and then we just talked amongst ourselves, kept it pretty quiet. Then friends and family started realising I had a portfolio and started asking how I did it, so I started having coffees with them. Then I got sick of having coffees, so I employed people to go and have coffees with them. So, and hence obviously the business started. But so yeah, I kept it quiet because everyone you talk to just makes you feel like crap, and then because they're not doing himself.
Yeah, I'm a bit the same. I still to this day don't tell people what I'm doing. You go about your own business, it's for your benefit. So no need to walk around and tell everyone what you're up to, what you bought, what you're doing, what your journey is, because you might get a dream crusher, you might get anything. It's important to you, not to them. So
well, either the dream crusher or that, the tall poppy syndrome. They just want to.
Absolutely. So
it's one or the other, unless you find people who are like-minded and surround yourself with those.
And Matt's just walking around telling everyone to listen. So that's it. Glad you hear it.
Yeah, so just be ready.
Thanks for the invite, boys.
Yeah, if you start big noting Ben, just be ready, mate.
All right, Daniel, what's your expectation for the Brisbane market now to start this little growth? He knows we don't have a crystal ball, but he's interested in our thoughts based on what we're seeing in the data.
Yeah, Brisbane's well and truly due for a spring, and it looks like it's in play now.
Yeah, I might actually, as much as I love data, I'm going to talk about something outside of data.
Whoa!
Wow, yeah,
that's crazy. Jesus, crazy.
Are you okay?
Yeah, no, I am.
It's that sunburn.
Yes, thanks again. Now. So I've lived in Brisbane before, and I spent 6 years up there, and still have family up in Brisbane, so I spend a lot of time up there as well. And if you look at Brisbane and you drive around Brisbane, there's a lot of older houses, and one of the things that Brisbane has kind of not had that Melbourne and Sydney has, which is a strong auction market. Melbourne and Sydney, the majority of properties go to the auction market, and obviously that means that every week prices get reset. So in a rising market, if there's a bit of FOMO, or fear of missing out, prices will push up relatively quickly. In Brisbane, most properties historically have been listed by private sale, and for prices to go up means that if an agent sells a property 1 week and they go, oh, that's sold in 30 days, maybe the next client they bid for work on, they might say, why don't you put your price up $5,000 because that one's sold in 30 days. Then they run a 60-day campaign and they might get a sale that's a bit higher, and then the process starts again. So it takes a bit longer for the market to start ramping up. So with Brisbane, that's kind of been the case historically. Now, one of the things that's really interesting, if you look at Brisbane right now, there's a whole heap of renovation work that's been going on in the last few years, and it's very hard to identify this in data. You have to really look at the properties on the market and what's been selling in historical sales, because value can be created in a market through renovations. It's not always just because of obviously supply and demand. If people go into an area and they renovate a house and 5 years later they decide to sell it, the price has been added artificially, it's gone up in value. They might not necessarily get all the money back that they spent, but it's pushed up the price in that local market. We're seeing a lot more high quality properties coming on the market through Brisbane, and that's actually lifting the mid to premium range in that Brisbane market. And that's something that's been missing for the last few years, and I think that's going to help to also drag up the rest of the market in Brisbane as well.
We get some questions about valuations, and you've just maybe touched on something that you might have an answer that helps that. So are the valuations looked at differently by valuer? If I've gone to auction, I was the last person to put my hand up and I've bought the property, versus I bought a property that was a private sale and I was the one who got it when it had been on the market for 30 days. Does the valuer walk in at that point and have a different lens, to use Cam's rose-coloured glasses, a different lens on how they value the property?
This is what you call answering your own question, but absolutely. So if you're buying at auction, obviously the process that it follows, if there was a competitive auction and you bid just a little bit more than the second bidder, and valuers will generally call agents to find out if it was competitive, then typically you're going to get a valuation on your contract price because the market has shown support for what you're paying.
That takes away their risk and hence their liability.
Takes away the valuer's risk. Now, if you're buying a private sale, then they're generally going to be valuing based on historical data. So they're not looking at what's on the market and they're not looking at what the price forecast is. Even if the prices are forecast to go up by 50% the next year, it means nothing to a valuer. They've got 6 months worth of historical data in that suburb to look at comparable sales. Now, if you're looking at comparable sales, the other thing that makes it a little bit trickier is if you go on a tool like RP Data where they track all of the historical sales, they'll show some pictures of the house, they'll have the size of the land, the size of the house, and they'll say whether it was like how many bedrooms, how many bathrooms, how many cars. That's it. So the valuer has to make a judgment call on why one property might have sold for $100,000 more than another one that's the same size land on with all the other same number of bedrooms, same number of bathrooms, same number of cars, saying, well, I don't know why there's $100,000 difference. So
you're saying one might have 10-foot ceilings, European appliances, designer tapware, designer doorware,
and if I'm
all above, and they're not picking that up. They're just saying, well,
and you also know there's nuances within a suburb. You can go from one street to the next and find a $30,000, $40,000 difference because that street might have more appeal to buyers who are emotional. And again, valuers can't necessarily use that. So we're seeing obviously a huge discrepancy in valuations coming through at the moment because prices are moving relatively quickly. And they're trying to base the valuation on something from sales from 6 months ago, when we know that the prices in most markets across Melbourne have gone up by 4% in the last 5 months alone. So
this is a massive answer for you, Dan, and I'll round it out. Some of the key things I look at: rental vacancy rates, property days on market, and the population in a particular city. All those are really favourable in Brisbane at the moment, so we're anticipating some growth in Brisbane. And as you've said in your question, we've seen the growth start. It's outperformed in the last little window of time. We think it'll keep going.
So to clarify that, because I didn't want to correct Al earlier, so when Al said Brisbane's outperformed, I just want to make sure it's clear. It's over the last 3 years, Brisbane's outperformed Sydney and Melbourne by about 8 or 9%. So it's a pretty good track record, and obviously part of that is because it's had a very stable run through the downturn, and it's still in a very good position to get more growth.
There you go.
Another question, I'll answer it first. What property or suburb has been your best ever investment? Each panellist. Matt might add to this, but I'll answer for Matt and I in my answer. So the first property that I bought with Matt. I didn't have the deposit to buy it myself. I had the advice of someone, my father in my ear, saying best time to buy is 20 years ago, if not, then it's tomorrow. So we scraped together, we got a deposit, bought a property, we paid $120,000 for it 21 years ago. The property we still own today, and it's recently had a valuation of $700,000. So there might be things that are done better in short little windows of time and fits and spurts, but it's a long game, and I can't really argue with the growth I've had in that over that period of time.
Yeah, I think it have to be similar. Bayswater in Victoria is probably the best performing property for me. Don't know why they call it Bayswater. It's not in the bay. There's no water around. Have you ever thought of that? Why do they call it Bayswater?
I don't know.
Anyway, all right.
Never crossed my mind. But now that you mention
Crossed
it,
mine a lot.
I won't
Been
sleep-
looking,
I
been
won't
looking for the
sleep
bay.
tonight.
That's it.
The only reason that, and now that's I bought it for 100 and something thousand, and it's now worth 800 and something thousand. So, but it's not what it's worth today. That's had the biggest impact in my life. The reason that property had been so significant to me was the growth I got at the start, because that was the first property I got. Once I purchased it, I was earning 22 grand a year then. By the time I'd signed the contract and settled on the property, it was worth about 40,000 more than I'd signed the contract for. So that had a huge impact in my life, because 40 grand when I was double my yearly wage, I could go and buy 2 more properties after that straight away. Whereas that property now being worth 800, it's like, no, it's nice, but it doesn't have as big an impact as how valuable that growth was at the start to me.
Yeah, well, Al was very, very disciplined at saving, which I must admit I never was. And I sort of had a different...
Saying he's tired?
no, not at all.
Thrifty,
yeah, that's right. So really the only investment I've ever made was my first investment. Now that's not to say that's the only asset I own, but the first investment I made with Al pretty much gave me money to reinvest into other assets, and kind of everything else followed from that one investment. So I never really had to save too hard early on, because we were cash flow positive pretty quickly. That allowed us to get our next asset. Then we had equity that allowed me to do more. So it kind of snowballed. So I guess what I'd say is I invested in the process of investing rather than just investing in one particular suburb or house.
Hey, I've got to bring you back, Matt, and tell you a quick story, because my mum's coming down
Where's this going?
weekend.
Where is
Well,
this
before
going?
you use
It's got that grin on his face.
No, before you use the term FOMO, and I laugh because my kids use terms like, and you're a bit younger than us, so that's okay. No, but I text mum because I tore my calf, as you know. I'm wearing one of those moon boots. I tore my calf at basketball, and I messaged mum and said, "Hey, I've torn my calf," and she wrote back, "LOL." Oh, no, she's really. I said, "What do you mean, LOL?" She goes, "Oh, lots of love." So you probably do need to clarify what FOMO meant. So there you go.
While Cam's on his story, so Bruce is online. I mentioned him before. Grew up with Cam. Bruce has just said he wished he'd listened. So everyone else, you can listen too. Another question: once you're financially independent, live off equity. This isn't from Bruce, but once you're financially independent, live off equity comfortably. Do you pay off all your outstanding debts, or do you keep some around? So I'm not sure if your question's insinuating you've got a boat debt, a car debt, a divorce debt somewhere. I don't know what it might be, but I think primarily you want to roll all your debts into the lowest possible interest rate you can, most likely a property debt, roll it into your line of credit there, and get it in there, and then work to pay it off as quickly as you can.
Yeah, it's a stage of life thing. And I think there's a few stages. There's obviously the acquisition phase, consolidation phase, and then carefree retirement. So it depends what stage of life you're at, how fast and hard you need to go at each of those stages.
Yep.
So we can't give specific advice. It's general advice in nature.
What's the question here from Marcus again? What's the best positive cash flow investment you have seen, and why was it so? I'm not sure, Matt, if you want to talk about. Well, there he is. If you want to talk about the 1Bs potentially.
Resi fund.
Yeah, look, many of you probably know that we've got a new fund that we launched recently called Resi Fund, and it's something we worked on for a few years. And
5 years.
So it was a long process, and essentially that fund has an investment strategy of buying assets that are cash flow positive. And when I say cash flow positive, I mean most of the assets we're buying at the moment are generating around an 8% yield on its costs. So that's obviously very cash flow positive, and what might surprise a lot of people is that they're not in regional areas, they're actually in established areas. And what we're building is essentially properties that have multiple tenancies within a single property that we don't need a planning permit for, and it falls under the Class 1B building code. So this building code exists all around Australia. Each council jurisdiction has their own way of applying it, but to put in perspective, in one of our assets in southeast Melbourne suburbs, close to a train station, we've got a 600 square metre block. We're putting up a 300 square metre dwelling with 9 studios in it, and a shared kitchen and shared laundry. And that allows us to get 9 tenants paying $310 a week, so $2,700 a week rent. Now, I'll talk about this, and I should probably caveat that it's a very hard type of asset to get into as an individual investor, which is why we're doing it through a fund.
So equity requirements about $900
couple $1 million buy.
Yeah, so
$800,000 equity.
$1.5 million for the asset, and you've got to have more than half of that to be able to build it, and you obviously got to have a very convincing case to be able to get the bank to fund it. So obviously it's a great asset, but it's not really achievable for a lot of investors till you've built up a portfolio or you're investing through our fund that gets you into that asset.
And even in terms of us, who are, I guess, large investors in terms of residential property, we're not doing them individually, we're doing them in a pooled basis because it spreads your risk. You can have more of them, have a bigger tenant pool, and you've got less risk of vacancy, things like that. So we're doing them as a collective.
Yeah, I don't want to use this platform to plug the fund, but the problem we wanted to solve was first-time investors couldn't get into the market, so you can invest as little as $1,000 into the fund. And the big issue, which I think was touched upon before, is how do you transition to retirement? You know? So a lot of people get to the back end, what's the exit strategy? You build up this portfolio, what do you do with it? And no one was really addressing the issue, which is why we spent so long building the fund and looking at that asset class, because people can, and I actually mentioned it before, one of our investors is reaching retirement and going back into rent vesting. What they're actually doing is selling their family home and putting it into a resi fund, because they'll more than achieve the requirements they need from a cash flow dividend to live off. So most people get to the end of retirement, asset rich, income poor, and resi fund allows them.
And the other thing is you get close to retirement, the last thing you want is to take on more debt personally as well. So he kind of wanted to make...
So you're comfortable saying, because Marcus wanted to know, and if you're not, that's okay, but Marcus's next follow-up question was, and what sort of returns it making?
So we're obviously we have a financial services license, so I have to be very careful about providing forecasts. So we had a 2% growth in the last month alone. So we're on track to achieve more than 10% in the next over this year. So yeah, so that's kind of the return. Obviously distributions, once our assets are fully let, generally will be around 5.5% to 6% on the investors' capital.
Yeah, so this resi fund is a buy and hold strategy, but it takes advantage of obviously high cash flow type properties that the average investor can't get into.
Yeah. All right, next question. Do you plan to speak to your kids about the property investment journey? And we want them to be educated but not cocky, complacent by expecting a big inheritance one day. How do you balance that out? That's from Felicity McLellan. It's not.
If it's from Felicity, that's her job. No. Felicity and I are probably we're the harshest on our kids as far as material things. So Hannah was the oldest daughter was the last person in her classroom to get a phone. So we make sure that they earn everything they get. I run a number of different. We've got a couple of wads, and I won't get into all the detail now. But on our website, we've got Elle and I have done different videos. But taking the kids into, they love those claw machines. They're pulling money out, and they'd spend $2 coins like it was going out of fashion. Trying to get them to understand the value of money and time versus money spent. So taking them to the supermarket and go, right, what does $10 get you in here versus the claw machine? So getting them to look at different investment options, and Lollies is an investment for them.
But the excitement, Dad.
And that was the trouble. They still don't believe me that they still play the machines.
What was also good was we had them at a place having dinner once, and they worked out, I guess it's about being creative and working your investment journey and how you get the things out of the claw machine. They worked out by turning the power on and off, they were getting free credits. They all walked out of the joint with about 600 toys each. It was really impressive, actually.
Yeah. So then you have to give them a lesson on honesty.
But Cam is also, and it's the title is quite clever and it's catchy and it's done a great job in terms of selling books for Cam, my 4-year-old, the property investor. Oh. But he did literally write the book for his kids. So it came about, if no one knows the story, Cam and I were going on a business trip
to Hawaii.
So there'd just been a tsunami or a typhoon or an earthquake or something had hit Japan. We're like, well, we're just across the water from that while we're there. We've got all this knowledge, what happens if it vanishes? I expected Cam to write a couple of paragraphs, but about 18 months later he's turned up. I've been compiling this for 18 months, I've written a book for my kids. Yeah. That's literally where the book came from. So yes, it's important to educate your kids, but you've got to make sure they're not cocky, and Cam's example is a great one. You can't have them getting everything they want, you've got to make them earn it, want it, and
yeah. I think it's okay to give your kids enough to start. It's not enough. It's not okay to give them enough that they don't have to do anything for themselves.
And what do they say? I might cock this one up, but you can lead a horse to, what is it? You can give a
You can
horse a drink.
You can make a horse fish.
You
but
quench
you
its
can't get
thirst.
two horses in a bush.
Give a drink to a horse, you can quench its thirst for the day, lead it to water, and it'll never go thirsty again.
Bird in the hands with two in the bush.
All right, let's just throw out everything we know. Every old saying. But
Don't spoil your kids and make them earn it themselves.
yeah, teach them how to invest so that they'll never need to rely on your inheritance.
Yeah, if I look back, my mum chucked us out at 14 and 9 months and said, you know, you're old enough to earn money now, and now you can buy your own clothes and socks. And so making sure your kids actually understand the value, and I think a lot of kids don't have part-time jobs. My kids are going to have part-time jobs, so understanding the value of time spent for money earned will make them appreciate money a lot faster than
Like fortnight
handouts.
credits and things like that. Cam's mum didn't teach him to buy pants because I haven't seen him in anything but shorts, and we're in November, so it's all of 2019, no pants. So,
No.
question here. Who'd win an arm wrestle out of Alan Cam? Don't know, but I can outrun him because he can't walk at the moment. What's the best investment type? Lots of different properties, house, unit, apartment and land. All got their positives, I guess, in their own way, but
I buy a house and land myself.
what do we talk about?
Yeah.
And the reasons?
If anyone wants to understand the methodology of the investment type we get, email Justin at opencorp.com.au and he'll give you a copy of free copy of my 4-year-old The Property Investor, which outlines basically the process of elimination to get the best property every time.
You hear some amazing things out there. I got a call from someone last week saying, a friend of mine bought a block of land for 15 million. He bought it 4 years ago with an 8-year settlement. He wants to sell it now for 60 million. Well, obviously straight away you go, wow, it's amazing, good on him, it's incredible. How do I do more of that myself? But if you actually break it down and go, what's happened? Well, ask him some more questions. He paid a $1.5 million deposit that if you can't sell in 8 years is gone. He had to pay another instalment of it now, which is why he's trying to sell it. And again, if you can't settle in another 4 years' time, which is 8 years, all those deposits, all that money's gone for him. So yes, you want the upside to be pretty great. It's incredibly risky, but that's an investment in land you can make. So there are different investment vehicles. What we talk about is residential property, house and land, for the reasons of you're holding an asset, which is the land, you've got a house on it, which is paying your rent, land increases in value, house depreciates in value. You got on lay-by effectively, someone's paying it off for you. Relatively safe, can't go too wrong if you're smart about where you buy it.
I remember, I do like house and land nowadays. I remember Felicity's cousin John bought a house through us, and he was whinging to me that he'd put a deposit on a place, on a block of land, and 18 months later, they hadn't started building yet. I said, so you've put a deposit of $2,000 on a block of land, and you've got 18 months worth of growth, and it had gone up over 100 grand, and he's whinging because the house hadn't started. I said, mate, you've just got the best investment.
But he hadn't even settled on the land, had he?
No, he hadn't settled on the land.
No.
Yeah,
He paid $2 grand, done nothing else, made 100 grand.
I think I said,
Like, can you delay it another 10 years?
yeah, I think I had that conversation with him about 4 times. The house is built now, he's got a tenant, so he's comfortable, but now he looks back, now he's got a tenant, he looks back at that as probably one of the best investment journeys he's had.
And for a lot of investors to seriously grow their wealth and achieve their financial goals, they need to be able to do something more than once, don't they?
Yeah, correct.
So if you do something the first time that's high risk and you're very nervous about it, you're probably not going to do it again because that made me feel really yucky and I don't want to experience that feeling again. But if you do something that's low risk, that's proven, that you know is going to work, and you kind of get through that and you go, actually that wasn't too bad, you're more likely to be able to repeat the process. That's all it is. It's just doing one thing, doing it well, repeating it again to get to the goal. And it's when people start to really, I guess, diverge off that path that things start to go.
Without the fear of big noting, because we didn't make all the investment ourselves, going on Matt's thing, what he was explaining then, we bought one block of land, put $1 million odd deposit down on it near Vic Gardens Shopping Centre, and sold that within, was it 3 months or 6 months we settled on it, and had a $5.5 million uplift in it. So put $1 million down, got 6 odd back. Once again, we weren't the entire investment arm in it, but you can't get those every day.
No, and we also probably have to be fair and say that not all of those investments that we've made in that type of thing have gone swimmingly.
Not at all.
Some misses as well. So
very much so.
Obviously,
and we've lost money along the way in those type of investments because they're high risk.
Yeah.
There's no more questions. Any last minute ones, please shoot them through. Guys, any last thoughts on, I guess, what's happened this year, which was the theme of the show since the start of the year when we talked December last year through to now?
No, probably the next show is probably more important as far as the content that's going to go in there. Amanda's going to give a really strong insight into the borrowing landscape. She comes from a huge, wealth of experience. Michael will be back, so you're going to have two powerhouses in the investment world battling it off with their knowledge.
Four of us.
No, I'm going to
Not five, no.
I've got Lucy's dance concert that night.
Oh, what a joy.
Yeah.
Sorry, Lucy.
Yeah. We'll have two bozzers, and
I love my kids, don't get me wrong, but I'd rather chew glass than watch a dance concert. It's horrendous.
This is how you make sure your kids don't feel
But
entitled.
it's 3 hours for like 1 minute of seeing your own kid. It's horrific.
And Lucy will watch this in 10 years' time, and that's okay, and I'll explain to her. But
Your dance was great, Luke.
yeah, it was beautiful. I loved it. I saw you up there.
Just get the video so they can laugh at themselves.
Matt, anything else?
No. I'm actually curious to know beyond the next show, like what's in store next year. Where do you guys see things going?
What we've got a big focus on is bringing guests in that I guess can add to the knowledge pool. So we as a business are pretty collective in our thoughts. We talk every day. So I guess a lot of the decisions by the time we get to here are thought through, talked about during the weeks beforehand. So we bring this new knowledge in. They've got different points of view, and I think it's really healthy for the show and get that knowledge out to other people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us, guys.
Thank you.
See you, Bruce.
Thank you. I meant to just stare at the camera now. I'm just staring at the camera. Thanks for coming to the show.